So I don't know exactly what critical language study is and could Mr. Nghĩa explain more
I
for
have
me
read
and some other teachers?
I have
Mhm.
read about it for just like months, and I think I'm a new guy in that aspect, just like you. Uh, how about at the end, I'll send you guys the links to
Mm.
the method that I
No,
am doing the reading on.
just
Okay,
just a symbol, just a
okay,
symbol simplification. Okay,
three,
just a
four.
symbol.
Just a brief definition. What?
Okay.
Because we are talking about
Can can
trains,
can
right?
can can you can you sir, Mr. Kwan, can you jump back to me for like for the next 5 minutes, and we can
Okay,
continue
sure,
the
sure,
discussion.
sure.
And
Right.
after that, I have to like search my file again. Yeah, because I'm sure I take notes somewhere. But yeah, I'll be back in the next five
Okay.
minutes.
All right. I will ask the another person. I will ask Miss Nguyễn Huỳnh Thu, right? Oh, Nguyễn Thu Huỳnh. What's your name again? Sorry. Thu, Miss Thu, right? Hello. Are you there? Oh, she's not here. All right. Miss Ngân Hà, are you there?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yes. Could you please share with us your research interests? Have you ever
Uh,
done research before?
well, actually, I have done just some very basic research. That is because I was finishing my graduation
Mhm.
thesis for the undergraduate level, and my topic at that time was the perceptions and the beliefs of university students for communicative language teaching.
Mhm.
Yes, so that was my topic of interest at that time. Yes.
Right. What about
Yeah.
now? What about your research interest now?
So after that painful experience, I feel like I need to accumulate more practical knowledge, so that I could have some sort of inspiration, some field that I feel inspired to do later research. So
All
right
right.
now, currently I'm not having any area of interest. Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Yes.
Now, I will ask you one more question before we move on to another person. But what are some research trends that you think are currently popular among the research communities in your country? By that I mean, what do people in like your school or in the people in your university usually talk about? The research trends. What do they like to talk about? Or even if you have been to like a research camp like Mr. Nghĩa, or you have been to a research some kind of TESOL conference, well, what are some popular common themes that people usually discuss there?
Is that for me?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry. um, well, like some research related to mixed level class, mixed ability class.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that kind of a lot, and maybe the vocabulary studying method. Like we have incidental and intentional, and many other
Mm.
types of way to learn vocabulary, right?
I think Ron Ellis had just published some new articles about incidental vocabulary learning. Anyway, yeah, please continue.
And what else? Oh, oh, actually, I do have an interest, and that is about classroom management. But I'm not sure if
Mm.
it can be a research area.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
classroom management, I think, is a common topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Right.
so those are my three areas. I would, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and Mr. Kai. The question goes to you. The mic is yours.
Uh, uh, okay. My research interest is about SFL, systemic functional linguistics, and recently I moved on to uh, um, narrowing chain in multimodality. Okay,
Multimodality.
focusing on video language materials.
Well,
And
yeah.
sorry, trends in Vietnamese research communities, I don't know. But before moving on to multimodality, I I dig in bibliography, bibliometrics research to know what's news or trendy in the community about the writing, and I learned a lot about a lot of researchers are interested in feedback, corrective feedback, written feedback. Yes,
Mm,
and I don't think at the time I read a lot of articles relating to writing. I have no caught a lot of research about ChatGPT or JustBoss at that time.
mm,
And I also don't think uh, Vietnamese teachers or researchers in Vietnam are doing a lot of studies relating to the ChatGPT or chatbots. In in uh, in my university, um, several professors uh, are not discussing so much about the ChatGPT or chatbots because you need to um, prove or give a lot of evidence to professors about the reliability
mm.
about these tools.
Okay,
Yes.
right. Now, well, similar to what you have just said, like the same topic, Miss Win An here, she is very concerned about ChatGPTs and AI, and she asked these questions like, well, I'm happy to join this workshop webinar. I joined some webinars similar to this. I just wonder if it is a good thing to ban AI and chatbots in writing. In my opinion, students who learn English in university need to use it because companies now use chatbots, but they don't really want to pay a lot for English master or PhD. People who only have IELTS with AI, they can do the job well. So I wonder if students need to learn English in university level. Well, thank you. Well, that is her question. But basically, we will discuss the new trends in language education. But new trends here, we mean research trends. So we will later on discuss whether like ChatGPT have any place in new our new trends of research in the future or right now. Okay. So I've discussed with three I don't know researchers right here, three teachers right here, and we've been talking about critical language studies. We've been talking about some common topics like CLT, mixed level class, vocabulary, incidental learning of vocabulary, classroom management, SFL, multimodality, corrective feedback, and so on and so forth. And we also have questions on whether we should focus on AI, whether we should ban AI. Well, now let's move on to something else. Let's move on to the next topic. Now I have a picture right here, and I would like to ask Andrew to help me with this one. Well, we have expert here, Andrew, Mr. Like Dr. Andrew Leon and Dr. Jason Anderson, Professor Andrew Leon and Dr. Jason Anderson. But right now, I will not, I will not ask you about the research. I just have one picture right here, and well, this is well, I don't know. It is like a catch-22. Sometimes we want to follow the trends, but sometimes we feel like what we are doing is not really does not really correlate with the trends that is currently popular right now, and sometimes we feel disheartened. Even for me myself, like before before 2022 2023 I used to think and used to write about affordance, like Jason, right? But at that time, people were not very interested in an affordance-based language teaching, and they just reject the article because it was not popular right then. It was not popular then. So the picture here reminds me of something very important for all of us. Well, when people are going on the right and you are the only one who go to on the left. So Andrew, what do you think? Is it important to follow trends, or is it important to recognize trends, but do you have to follow it? Can you share with us some of your experience? And yeah,
I thought you were going to show us a picture.
do you see the picture?
No?
No,
I
sorry.
can see the picture. It's in Quang's second
All right.
screen.
Maybe it's
Can you see it now?
no.
Nope.
Anyway, maybe
Anyway.
it doesn't matter. Maybe it
Oh, well,
doesn't
wait.
matter.
I will share it again. Can you
That's
share?
okay.
Can you see it now? Hello.
Oh, okay.
All
Well,
right. It is like a
interesting to hear
TOEIC
Jason.
test.
It'll be
Get
interesting
the
to hear
pictures.
Jason as well. You know, don't just pick on me. The issue of trends is that the trends. I have a favorite statement at the moment, and my favorite statement is, "The dogma defeats the data." And by that I mean that it doesn't matter how much data you have to show the success of something or other. The strength of the dominant discourse is such that in general it swallows the data and puts it aside. So I was reading a little bit of Jason's stuff today. You know, he was criticizing the phrase second language acquisition, correctly so, but it takes a long time to switch, for example, from second language acquisition to additional language. I don't know whether it's additional language learning or just additional language. Simply because of habit and because outliers tend to be identified as anomalous. If you're an outlier, I've been an outlier all my life. It hasn't helped my career very much. It's true, I've been a professor several times, but that doesn't mean anything other than you get a title from someplace or other. But in terms of impact, so if you look at the impact, who are the people with impact? Rod Ellis, who has been construed as the grandfather of SLA, whereas in fact it's completely wrong. He is more like the grandchild of SLA, with people like Pit Corder and Larry Selinker as being the prime movers of the movement. Let's put it that way. And so people work on stereotypes. They work on habits. They don't necessarily look back critically at what's happening. SLA, for example, in America is used to mean the same thing as language learning, although Krashen a long time ago decided that he was going to make a distinction between a nonsensical distinction, if I could put it this way, between language learning and acquisition. Because in the end, learning is learning is learning. However you define it, you may want to take some turns along the road. So the problem with outliers and going left or right is that the people who turn right don't listen to the person who goes left, even if the person who goes left actually has something to say that may be relevant. And so it takes time and it takes energy to become visible. And mostly we become invisible, we stay invisible. Max Planck created a statement which I have in my signature on email, which says, science progresses from funeral to funeral. And what that means is that change only seems to happen when the people in power disappear. The funeral can be real or it can be virtual. So the question then is, how do you bring about change? And one of the ways is to directly criticize the people in power. The other way, another way, is to demonstrate repeatedly that some forms of change are possible. And what's interesting is that there are actually kind of underground movements in the field which are quite strong within themselves, but never become actually mainstream. So if you go into a standard MA-TESOL program in Thailand or wherever, you will still hear the Krashen dogma being repeated. You will still hear the Rod Ellis statement being made. You may hear, because it's becoming so powerful, social justice discourse talking about critical literacy. And it was quite funny the other day, somebody said that the programs in our Thai university were too white, which I thought was kind of interesting. The notion of whiteness, which is heavily Americanized, has suddenly migrated into the Southeast Asian context. It's kind of interesting. So the question is, so what's the opposite of whiteness? Is it blackness? I don't think so. Anyway, that's just a joke.
Bluetooth mode.
So I think it's important to reward difference, to recognize difference, and to not efface it, not to remove it, and simply call it anomalous. Remember that in terms of learning, we are not, although we use statistics a lot, we are actually not statistical beings in the sense that our profile matches the statistics of group studies. Because they don't. I mean, if 86% of people do this or that, it doesn't mean that you do. And it doesn't mean that when you combine this particular 86% with that particular, a second kind of, 57% and so on, the profile that comes out is no longer standard. And that's the basis of what I call precision language education. Precision language education, which is a term I happen to have coined, but it's not a new term. Precision education has been around for a while, and it's based on the notion of precision medicine, which came out of the United States. Precision medicine states fundamentally your disease is your disease and not a statistical disease. And so we have to treat you in ways which are specific for your situation. Precision language education tries to do the same kind of thing. And there's an article which I wrote some time ago in GEMA, the online journal. There's a new book chapter I've had come out this year on rhizomatic systems and precision language education, which argue for the recognition of individual differences on a moment-to-moment basis. That doesn't happen in real life. People think that because they do group work or pre-task, task, post-task, or TSLT and TBF, that this kind of deals with it. It doesn't. It just deals with the teacher's preoccupations. And I wanted to make 3 points, and then I'll be quiet because I've been talking for quite a while. The first point that I wanted to make is that we are embodied. This is not new in some way, but embodiment means that we cannot bypass the body. This is really, really important. We cannot bypass the body, which means that we cannot bypass the biological or physiological factors that stand between the mind and the world. That's the first thing. The second thing is that teachers are not mind readers. It doesn't matter how often Rod Ellis, because he did say that, we heard him, Wang and I, at a conference when I was one of the keynotes, and so was Rod Ellis, that we have to know our students. And the answer is, well, you can know your students a bit, but you can never know them enough to be able to identify the problems that they have at every moment of their learning. This is what I call moment-to-moment problems. And the third thing is that we as teachers and administrators, I have to add, are fixated on getting people to learn what we want them to learn, rather than either what they need to learn or what they want to learn. So we have classes on, oh, we have to do this and we have to do that, and we have to have this particular grammatical point, and so on. And people like David Crystal will say things like, oh, there's only 44 sounds of English. We should be able to handle that. And then he adds in his next sentence, I found him on YouTube saying this, that's right. And then he adds in his next sentence, there's only 3,000 grammatical rules of English. Well, we should be able to handle that. But the real Everest, to quote Jason, the real Everest is vocabulary. There are 1 million words out there. It's according to the numbers vary, of course, between 600,000 and millions. Anyway, there's a lot of words. And he says that's where the real challenge lies. So he's kind of trivializing the problems of pronunciation and the problems of grammatical knowledge and understanding, which are not about form. Not even Michael Long would argue that they were just about form. They're actually about semantics. They're actually about understanding and meaning making. And you can have highly competent professors of English in Thailand, for example, who, when you ask them the question, when the rain is coming down, you say to them, what do we say now? It rains or it's raining? And half of these people with PhDs will say it rains. And of course, the answer is it's raining. So they don't know that what we often talk about as basic distinctions between present simple and present continuous, which is, of course, one of the lessons that we have in our English classes fairly early. In some ways. So I just thought I'd mention these. I wanted to add one more thing about the Douglas Fir group that Jason does talk about, and that, as far as I can tell, the Douglas Fir group, which is kind of telling us, A, that they are the bosses of language education, and B, that they have found the key to the new world. I've noticed that not one of them, as far as I can tell, is anything but an English teacher. I mean, there are actually people who teach other languages and who speak other languages. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the TESOL field, which rules the language learning field, is somehow so Anglo-centered. And by Anglo, I mean English-centered, not necessarily. I keep arguing that TESOL lives between Hawaii and Dover. That's the extent. And people actually don't talk about the Max Planck Institutes in Germany. in Netherlands. We actually do amazing research that we never hear about in the language education area because we're so busy worrying about Rod Ellis. And I say this with the greatest respect to Rod Ellis. He's made huge contributions to the field, and so has Chomsky. And both of them now are waning because that's the way things are. And so we move on. And I leave you all with one question. Have we solved the problem of language learning? And the answer is a resounding no. We're still struggling with basic concepts. What's language? What's learning? What's language learning? What's SLA? Should it be additional language? Is it fairer and more socially just to talk about addition? What about translanguaging? Well, guys, I've got news for you. We've been translanguaging for thousands and thousands of years. It's not new, but people are now making their careers out of translanguaging studies and social justice together, given the woke mentality, which appears, well, on the US side in particular.
Right.
So I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. I've spoken far too long, but I think I've covered most of the things I wanted to say. So.
Right. So it is quite, well, I was quite crazy and I was quite out of my mind when I raised the topic new trends in language education research. But then I asked this question, should we move with the trend? Right. And and I think that was a right decision. That was the right decision because most of my research student who in the research methodology class or novice researchers, well, I'm a novice researcher as well, but I've been doing research for a few years. So for those who have just started writing the first or the second research articles, they usually come to me and ask, well, Mr. Wang, I hear that this one is popular and this one is popular or that one is popular. So if I write about this or I write about that, it would be more publishable. Is it true? Yes, basically it is true that you will create something that basically I think people will like what you create because the topic is popular. It's just like, well, nowadays if you sing opera to a lot of teenagers, well, they will not stand that. But if you sing pop songs or instrumental music, then that would be very easy on them, and they will, and you will be likable. But is that important or not? So, Jason, I would like to come to the next questions, and I think it is quite an important question. Well, sorry for the screen not showing the full sentence, but what makes a research trend trendy? What do you think?
Thank you, Quang. Well, you've put me on the spot a bit there because I was presuming I was going to respond to some of the questions and interests of the other speakers and also Andrew's. This is a really interesting question. What makes your research strand trendy? Interestingly, I was in preparation for this, I was looking at one of the Google tools called Google Trends. And you can look at that to see how trends are, what is trending at a specific moment in time, much better for short periods when compared to, say, Google Ngram for books. And I don't know if I can share my screen. If the option is there, I can show some interesting things there. But that question itself, I'm not sure I'm either qualified or certain. I'm not experienced enough to answer that question. It's the kind of thing that Andrew, with so many years, if you don't mind me saying, Andrew, more experienced than me, will probably be able to reflect on more. I'm still quite new to the field of academia and of doing research. I've been a language teacher and language teacher educator for 25 years. But now I've reached that point where I want to contribute to the academic discourse. And so I've started doing quite a lot. But in that sense, I haven't been on the research network, if you like, for long enough to be able to answer that question, particularly because I think it's a very different question to the one you asked me to consider, which is what topics are trendy, what topics are actually happening now, which is one I can answer. Either in my country, in the world, but also responding to some of the earlier speakers who talk about things such as, I've just made notes here, ChatGPT and its potential and the potential impact of AI critical language studies, what that is and how it's important. And also Ngan Ha's points about much more specific to classroom and teaching, which are interests that I share much more. I'm not so much a language researcher in the sense of I'm interested in either English or any other language. I'm much more interested in teaching and what it becomes in educational systems, the formal act of teaching, not necessarily language learning. These are complexly different things, and in order to understand and improve language teaching, we don't just need to look at language learning and then extrapolate to the classroom. We need to look at what language teaching is in educational systems, which we all work in, I think. So would it be okay if I kind of answered the question about what is, in my opinion, trendy
Yes,
at the
yes.
moment, what I think is increasing, rather than what makes a research strand trendy? And we can come back
Yes.
to this and everyone can maybe suggest some ideas. Thank you. Is there any chance, Quang, that I can get the opportunity to share my screen?
Sure. Let me
Thank you, thank you.
let me
Because
make
one of our colleagues mentioned a really useful source of evidence, which is the bibliometric studies. And I recently, not recently, 2018, did some analysis on one of the most important ones, and that can offer us a research-informed perspective on this, even if it's a little bit limited by the nature of bibliometric studies and what they're able to analyze and not. It would be interesting, yeah. So I can't see an option to share my screen yet.
I think because you're using the browser based,
Shame.
you cannot share.
Okay. Well, let me talk about it anyway, no worries. Let me just first of all mention the 3 studies in question. There's one by Lei and Liu, Chinese researchers, in Applied Linguistics Journal, called Research Trends in Applied Linguistics from 2005 to 2016, a bibliometric analysis. There's one published by Xian Zhang, also from China, I believe, or at least his background is from China, or hers, in studies in second language acquisition, a bibliometric analysis of second language acquisition between 1997 and 2018. Sorry, yes, and Zhang is at the University of North Texas. I'm just looking now. And then there's another interesting one on EAP research by Ken Highland and Feng Zhang, a bibliometric study of EAP research, who is doing what, where, and when. And there's some important things that can be kind of extrapolated and are shared by all of these. The first one probably won't surprise anyone, and that is that the multilingual turn really has happened, in the sense that in the 21st century, we're interested in studying and understanding multilingualism in more complex ways, both as a phenomenon in itself and within language teaching, language learning, more broadly specified, not just, for example, English language teaching or additional language learning, by which I mean the study of additional languages in schools. So, for example, that Vietnamese students may learn Chinese in school, or they may learn English, they may learn both of those languages. Those would be additional language subjects. And as Andrew mentioned, the key kind of trend that is there, that is very obvious, is translanguaging, and the huge exponential, and it really is exponential, rise in interest in what translanguaging is and why it's important. And I think the most important thing to reflect on there isn't necessarily the important fact that, as Andrew notes, translanguaging has existed for, well, since way before named languages existed. I've done a lot of research in India where people very rarely make use of English without using other languages, or when Hindi, one of India's most commonly used languages, is used, English is translanguaged in with it constantly. But the key question I think that is really interesting to ask, and this may help to answer the question about why things become trendy, is to understand why translanguaging has become so important. And I'll just make one really simple point in that direction, is that translanguaging, I think, speaks to the need of learners and teachers around the world in multilingual contexts much better than prior paradigms within language teaching, language education, ELT, TESOL, and even communicative language teaching. the vast majority of teachers around the world share other languages beside the language that we're studying. So if we take English language teaching, for example, in Vietnam, the majority of teachers will share a common other language that may be Vietnamese or a dialect or a local language with their learners. And yet, because of, if you like, the dominant discourses of the 20th century in English language teaching, particularly, as Andrew quite rightly says, this is a world dominated by Anglophone discourse, by this Anglophone centre that Robert Phillipson also talks about, and yet still controls essentially the discourse communities. But I think that translanguage is important because so many teachers suddenly find that something that they've been denied by the discourse and even potentially dogma that's come out of that Anglophone centre is that English language teaching is best conducted in monolingually, English only or English mainly contexts, and that even when we draw upon other languages, we should do so judiciously. That adverb is often used, interestingly, as if there's some kind of problem with drawing upon our learners' prior knowledge, which is always encoded linguistically. And that suggests resistance, if you like, to what is potentially a paradigm shift that might even be moving beyond simply the boundaries of additional language classrooms, such as the so-called English lesson or the Chinese lesson or the English or Chinese curriculum, for example, for learners in Vietnam, to ask the question exactly, how are languages and education coming together? And for example, what's the relationship between new types of language teaching, such as EMI, and CLIL, C-L-I-L, Content and Language Integrated Learning, and the extent to which these are really different things or new ways of languaging, because if we actually look at data from these classrooms, we often find complex multilingual practices. And in this sense, I think, and also bilingual education in, for example, diverse, super diverse urban environments, such as big cities. Bangkok is one of them. And think about what's actually happening in a school there with learners from very different first language backgrounds. When I was there, it was very interesting to see, and I know Andrew, I think, is working there. I've never been to Vietnam, but I suspect you get to see the same things there. And in, of course, Western cities, we see incredibly diverse classrooms, teachers interacting with students from sometimes 20 or 30 different first language backgrounds in the same classroom and having to teach in those rooms. And this is another reason why translanguaging is important. It both speaks to the needs, the backgrounds, and the social injustices of teachers around the world who have been forced to teach in a certain, and one might even say, Anglophone way. I'm sure that Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores would argue that this is a product of essentially Western, American, white racial linguistics. And it was really interesting that Andrew mentioned that that word is now being used in Thailand to invoke this same identity for it. And there's a degree of validity to it, but also a degree of borrowing from an American discourse community that actually operates quite differently to how, for example, in Europe, we talk about language, race, background, identity, and other related issues such as decolonizing or decentering, moving away from the Anglophone centre. And of course, it's also different in Southeast Asia, it's different in Africa as well, and different in South Asia as well, in India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, for example, and Sri Lanka. So in all of these communities, we're seeing this shift in our understanding of what language is, what it does for us, and its role in the classroom. Not necessarily based on research that is new about language use. Of course, Grosjean and Vivian Cook talked about these ideas, the ideas underpinning it, such as Vivian Cook's multi-competence, but that what it's giving us as language teachers is what's making it an important discourse. There's a sense of reclaiming something that belongs to us, but we've been denied. And when I say we, I'm not actually talking about people who look and talk like me, i.e. white, male, British native speakers. I mean, we as in language teachers all around the world, because the majority of us, the vast majority of us, haven't necessarily learned English from an early age. We're additional users of English in the sense L2 users, to use that term, non-native speakers, or we could simply talk about ourselves as multilingual and translingual teachers. And in one of my articles, I used the phrase translingual teacher to invoke this idea of a more capable teacher, a more capable model than the native speaker, non-native speaker dichotomy. So that's an example of one of the things I think that has increased, and some of the reasons why I think it's really interesting. I'll just mention a couple of the other ones that I think are,
Can I interrupt
yeah,
briefly,
please do.
just for 1 second? The other thing that the translingual trend does is it actually undermines the notion that bilingualism in early childhood has to be delayed. In other words, there are millions of people around the world who are raised on multiple languages simultaneously. And guess what? They don't suffer. They are okay. But there was a trend, particularly in the 70s, which said first you have to learn your own language, and then you have to build, then you have to do these other things. So first you learn English, and then you learn, I don't know, French. First you learn Vietnamese, and then you learn English. I think that the translingual thing debunks to a large extent that mindset. And so it's not just about the classroom, but also about life in general, if you like. It can be, I mean, people don't know my background. I was born in Egypt. And you've been to Egypt, Jason. You know that people speak multiple languages. But certainly when I was there, the situation was very different. We all spoke 4 languages from birth. And it was okay. Nobody said, no, you must learn your mother tongue first, whatever your mother tongue was supposed to be. And I have no idea what my mother tongue would have been because of the mix. Okay, I'll just leave it there. I just thought I'd briefly mention this non-classroom aspect of the translingual issue.
Absolutely. This notion that codes are the a norm, and that our languaging practices move between them. And that's why so many of the writers on translanguaging are very, very careful to separate it from code switching, because it requires a shift, if you like, from one to the other perspective. It's our so-called first order languaging that is the norm, and codes that have been applied as an attempt to codify them, to understand them, when in fact that may not actually be the best way to do it. Yeah, the really interesting point. Thank you, Andrew, for that point. And feel free, anybody else, just to jump in and say something. I'm just looking at this table, as I say, and it's a blog post I wrote a few years ago. But I'm looking at Lian Liu's supplementary data. I pulled out of it what were the largest changes in topic frequency. And we got things like social class, multilingualism, teacher cognition, lexical diversity, interesting other aspects of SLA, traditional SLA, have declined, particularly things like universal grammar. And in fact, the grammar focus in general. And yet the focus on Lexis seems to be increasing. And this is across all 3 of these bibliometric analysis, we find it. And we've also found all 3 actually mention mixed methods. So if we're actually asking about research approaches, those of us who are drawing on a combination of methods, particularly between the quantitative and qualitative so-called paradigms, that seems to be much more popular. It doesn't mean that the others are declining, but there's certainly mixed methods wasn't popular before. My feeling is also that qualitative research is increasing, particularly in universities where people are doing things like PhD and MA studies. In our department in Warwick, whilst I think it's not necessarily typical, there is a very strong qualitative tradition that you see in many of the research students. And typically small size studies looking at specific aspects of social practice in classrooms, around classrooms, but also beyond language teaching in society in general. And looking at these through some of the methods that also come up highly in this list include things like discourse analysis and critical. 2 of the people mentioned, if not 3, critical language studies. What do we mean by that? What is that? It's definitely not an area of expertise of mine. But if we look at, for example, some of the researchers who are becoming prominent in America, and whilst, as Andrew said, and as I would love to do, we should be moving away from worrying or wondering what America is doing, the reality is it still dominates the discourse because of the power of the institutions there, the journals and the relationship between them, and the general kind of academic discourse. So if you look at Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, who are two rising researchers in the field of racial linguistics and understanding that, they have kind of risen in terms of their recognition and their citations incredibly quickly, because this is where the discourse is at in America. And it's interesting that if we keep focusing on and assuming, for example, that the term SLA is the primary knowledge base underpinning what we do, we overlook the fact that these other communities are building up new areas of language understanding, research, and learning that simply didn't exist really 20, 30 years ago. Quang also mentioned the decolonizing initiative is another important one. And it's really important to recognize that this is where so many people are talking and what is influencing what they're doing. The extent to which it will influence and does influence classrooms is an open question, because Andrew also made another point that universities, and particularly pre-service teacher education, tends to be more traditional. So I completely agree with the point he made that we still hear lecturers often lecturing students in and then kind of testing them in understandings of Krashen's acquisition learning distinction, that even in 1994, Rod Ellis, in the introduction to the study of his book, first edition of the book on second language acquisitions research, he rejects Krashen's distinction, and at the time pretty much everyone did. But it's amazing how that became embedded in university curricula. And that reflects something I think we see across education systems around the world, that things become embedded in curricula that themselves remain very, very pervasive, such as when we teach in our curricula. Let's imagine, let's talk about, for example, the Vietnamese national curricula for learning English. And we think about what teachers are required to teach their learners that don't actually necessarily relate directly or necessarily in any way to language learning. I was always interested that global ELT course books are obsessed with this area of language learning, so-called reported speech. Yet I listen around and I don't hear anybody using that bit of language. And it's a good example of kind of at the school or at the language learning level, discourses that become embedded that aren't necessarily useful. So I think to answer the general question about what research interests are becoming popular, I would say there is really, really good evidence, and this kind of is consistent with my own writing and beliefs, because obviously I do look at these sources of evidence to write, that there is a general shift away from the more cognitively focused SLA, but not completely, because certain areas such as how we learn vocabulary is still very, very popular. But specifically the notion of grammar and the notion of universal orders of acquisition, whilst not necessarily discredited, I think many of us recognize that there are some universalities, but that they're becoming less important in the sense that we don't necessarily see them as being fundamental to teaching and learning of languages. And things that are becoming more important, David Block was a good barometer of this when he talked about the social cultural turn way back in 2000. The social cultural turn is definitely happening, and it's happening for the learner and the teacher. So research on teacher identity is another field that I haven't mentioned, but that some of the bibliometric analyses also pick up on. And the reason for that is linked in complex ways, I think, to the general social justice change that's happening. And that is that we as language teachers don't necessarily speak the language we teach as our first language. In other words, we don't identify it as my language. And so if I'm a Vietnamese teacher of English, English is a subject I teach, I identify as a teacher, maybe, or a teacher of English, for example. When I use the example of the 8 expert teachers in India that I worked with, only one of them identified primarily as a teacher of English. The other 7 saw themselves primarily as teachers. I'm a teacher. I love teaching. I can teach anything. One of them put it in those words. And that, I think, is really important, because that issue of identity is really complex when the language we teach is a complex relationship to our primary identity, that we need to explore it, we need to understand it. And, and that will help us, I think, to recognize our identity. Who am I? The multiple identities I possess in my teaching and work. So yeah, I think two kind of broad trends: the multilingual turn and the social cultural turn, and all of the implications it has both for research methodologies and understanding ourselves. I think that's really important part of what is changing. And as regards to some of the other things you've got on this slide, really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff on this slide. Artificial intelligence and big data and ChatGPT. I can talk a little bit about what we do at Warwick if we have time, or what we're planning to do, because it's so new. But that is very new, I think. EAP is definitely on the rise. We see this, and particularly the bibliometric analysis by Highland and Zhang is a really good one to look at there. I would put it in the chat, but I don't seem to have a chat link because I'm using the browser version for this. But I'm sure you'll be able to find it.
You can send it to Facebook Messenger for me if
Okay, okay, cool, great. I'll send those links in a moment so you can share them as well with the participants. But I want to shut up now and hear about what other people are thinking and what other participants want to contribute.
Okay, please send it to me later on. But
yeah, I'll send this to you in a moment. Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is that when we talk about translanguaging and especially in our countries, and I know that you have just published a book called about the South continent, right? Something like that, right?
Teacher expertise in the global South.
Yes, in the global South. And well, that was interesting because the research here in our country is much different. But the way that we do things is much different from Western countries. For example, when we talk about CLUE or EMI, the problem here is that you have a classroom of a Vietnamese teacher teaching, I don't know, aviation subjects to Vietnamese students in English. And the problem is that, well, I noted two things right here. The first one is social justice is the driving force behind all the trendy styles that we have now. Isn't it? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah,
so the first one, right? Social justice is a driving force. And the second thing is technology. So both of them are the driving force of the changes in society. But the problem is that, well, if you look at EMI from the perspective, or if you look at translanguaging from a perspective of social justice, that's nice. But when you look at the mechanical precisions that is required to teach a subject in English, well, that is another problem. As I said earlier, like in an aviation class, Vietnamese teacher teach Vietnamese students in English. And let's just imagine that if there is kind of misunderstanding or misinterpretation of a language which is not their mother tongue, then what would happen? Plane crashes, life sacrifice, or even in medicine schools, they try to teach many subjects in English. Vietnamese teacher teaching Vietnamese students. And then, like, if they are going to be doctors in the future, and if they failed in operations because of the EMI things that they deliver in the classroom, then what would happen? So by translanguaging and by multilingualism, it does not mean that we use English to teach students everything in about their subjects, but we have to make sure that
Can I just interrupt there? It's really interesting. One of the IATEFL plenaries this year at the IATEFL conference, which those people who I think who are IATEFL members can see them online. It was really interesting. What was the name of the speaker? He's one of the top kind of business English consultants in the UK at the moment. His name is, sorry, I'll remember in a moment. Ivan Frendo, that's it, Ivan Frendo. He was talking about the fact that how that doesn't necessarily seem to happen that often, that individuals from very different backgrounds, different levels of competence are actually using, and lingua franca English is of course a term which still is increasing in the literature, and are using English as a lingua franca in really complex work situations, and yet negotiating, as the old SLA term would have, negotiation for meaning or to meaning, successfully, in the sense that those ambiguities, I'm sure there are plenty that do exist as examples, but are maybe not as frequent as those of us who are interested in language use precision would maybe want them to be. So the fact that some students may say it rains rather than it's raining, the important thing is if the point of reference is clear, it rains, therefore we need our umbrella. It doesn't actually matter too much in that particular exchange which of the verb forms we use. So, sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, but I think that I would like to
But it
mention.
does, but if I can just respond to Jason, but it does matter whether you pronounce the S at the end of a word. So, well, it does, because if somebody says to you, as we do in Thailand, give me the book, you say which one, they say all of them, because somehow, despite the context, you have not necessarily been able to identify what they are talking about. And that happens in multiple and very subtle ways that are not quite as obvious as the ELF people would like us to believe. Now, I have no argument with ELF. I see it as a dynamic rather than as a language, because, and you see, part of the problem is people now say, we will speak in ELF. No, you won't. You're going to speak with your own brand of English, which will be dynamically negotiated with yourself and the rest of the world.
But that is in the latter phases. Remember, here, the English as a lingua franca movement has gone through several phases, and the attempt to codify a version, I think they've moved beyond that and recognized that it isn't actually codifiable. But your definition there, Andrew, of what people do is exactly what I think, for example, Martin Dewey, Alessia Kogo, Jennifer Jenkins would argue is what lingua franca is about now. And interestingly, I think the third person S is probably, most people would argue, is largely, not completely, I'm sure you can think of examples, but largely redundant. But the S on the plural, the example you gave of book versus books, I don't think has necessarily been argued to be redundant. I think that's a really useful bit of language to teach our students. One of the best bits of grammar.
You're sure, but the point I'm trying to make is that some of these distinctions, and I think we're moving towards a kind of Esperanto, English Esperanto, to which I have no objection, by the way, is that not every departure from, let's call it standard English, is particularly useful or is particularly acceptable, right? I mean, just as a stupid example, if you talk about a ship or a sheep, as I said, it's a stupid example, it does actually make a difference. And so there are some distinctions or some changes which may be part of, well, take a very common example in which is not relevant, which is not useful to distinguish with, but people need to get used to. In Wang, stop moving the screen.
Sorry.
The L and N. L and N are confused in Thai, in Vietnamese, and Chinese. So instead of saying click, people say knick. Right? That's okay. You can adjust to that. But if people say own instead of old, then you have a problem. And that happens all the time. My own people did this. What own people? Oh, old people. Is that what you meant? And I happen to be very close to someone who does this all the time and makes my cognitive load very heavy in trying to understand what she's trying to say. Right? So it's not simply me being socially unjust by insisting that we have some, I mean, we need, look, semiotic systems have to have rules within them. You cannot have ruleless or entirely, what's the word? Anarchic semiotic systems. I mean, it just doesn't work.
So
So we need to identify what we're going to keep and what we're going to remove, and we can argue what they are. But we need to have some regularities, otherwise we're not going to be able to speak, at least in this language which we currently call English. By the way, of course, English is not the only lingua franca. French is, Spanish is.
Can I just respond again there,
Sure.
Andrew? I don't think we will define what those rules are. Those rules exist. I agree with you completely that and I don't think any of us, and indeed the lingua franca academics, are arguing in any way, and I'm sure you're not suggesting this, that there is a free for all. No one is suggesting that. But I think what an important outcome of this, and when we look at particularly like reading Suresh Kanagaraja's writing about multimodality, which is another word that is increasing. One of our colleagues mentioned it, I forgot to say,
Yes,
in the research literature. But not just multimodality, but how complex interactions actually happen, how we get meaning done, how we get meaning across, how we interact. That those rules exist, and it's much more a case of understanding and discovering them rather than trying to impose them.
Correct. Correct.
But
we
the
still
problem is,
we still need to be able to perceive them in action, if you like. We cannot simply invent them as we go along and expect other people to get it.
well, from my perspective, we're currently looking at translingualism and multilingualism from a perspective of social justice. And we do that because of the social justice advocacy. We want a just world. But the problem is that, I don't think that it is possible to apply translanguaging in teaching. And the first question a students or parents will ask all of us, like researchers, is that what English are you going to teach us? And that is a very hard question to answer. What English are you going to teach us?
And it's also a question which is very difficult for teachers to answer. Or is it?
Right. So
or is it? Because we do make choices all the time.
Chinese English or Vietnamese English? Or what kind of English are you going to teach us? The problem with our train of research is that, because I have already mentioned that social justice is currently the driving force of most of the training stuffs in our field. We do things because we love to discuss about social justice, but that is another problem. We sacrifice something, right?
There's a really interesting issue you've raised there about two things that are to some extent completely irreconcilable. If we look at language learning primarily and teaching as the add-on, and that is the relationship between that key stakeholder in education, the parents of the children you mentioned, Quang, there, and the other side of things, which is exactly what actually happens in terms of what we teach in the classroom. The reality is what most teachers teach in terms of what type of English will be defined by a national curriculum. Yet national curricula feature so rarely in the discourse on applied linguistics and language teaching, where there is so much of an emphasis on student-oriented curricula, which obviously has a really important logic to it, but very little social reality for many teachers and learners and their parents. And as a result, it's really important to recognize that kind of conversation between the teacher and the parents is a very different area of research that we don't actually look at very much. And we need to, I think, because what actually happens there is really important for the parents and the students and the teachers' well-being in that complex relationship.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt there.
Yeah, and that is
but that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Sorry to interrupt again, Quang. Never mind. You're tough. But that's a very good point. I mean, I've been on countless curriculum syllabus committees in various states in Australia, and the reality is that people create the syllabuses. They are forced to create their own work programs in schools, and they do whatever it is that they do. But actually, they don't have the syllabus in their heads. Not the syllabus, the curriculum, the national curriculum, sitting in their heads as providing guidelines. They wing it. They kind of adapt the textbook to make it look a bit as if it was the national curriculum. And so in the end, the curriculum disappears, and perhaps it should, or perhaps it shouldn't. That's a different issue altogether. But teachers look at them, or administrators look at them, parents look at them, kids should look at them, but they never do. And then on top of that, you have the clash with the research and the practices. And quite often teachers say, oh, thank God we finished our stupid master's program. I won't have to ever to remember about universal grammar again, and I'll do what I know works well.
That complex relationship between the official curriculum, the enacted curriculum, and the hidden curriculum as well. All of these things which have been discussed, but I think sometimes underemphasized, because that's the reality where what we as teachers, language teachers in the vast majority of primary and secondary classrooms where we work, that's what we have to deal with, and that complex relationship is really important.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but we've been focusing quite heavily on translanguaging and multilingualism, but we haven't talked about one part that I think participants would like to listen about. That is technology in language teaching and under research trains. They've been doing research about AI and ChatGPT and AR and VR, things like that. So now, well, I do not see them as two separate fields, but I think that, like, a few days ago, I received one article from Call EJ, and there they sent me an article about using technology to limit the time that students need to spend with the teacher inside the classroom, but rather they can learn from their own rooms, their own from the library, things like that. So they start to do research about personalization, or in Andrew terms, some kind of rhizomatic system, a self-regulated system, and that brings me to another keyword. That lead me to another keyword, that is the deconstructionism trend. We start to unstructure, destructure English teaching, language teaching in general, and we start to deconstruction. We start the deconstructionist trend in terms of education in general. We remove the teacher from the classroom, and we remove like lesson plan, right? Like Jason, you've been talking about a pro forma lesson plan and teaching even without lesson plan, a foreign based. So are we moving on the same?
But not removing one. Not removing one, just different ways of doing that. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong to remove it, just that wasn't the point I was making.
Right. So can you guys, like Andrew, and I know Andrew is very experienced with Call, and Jason also, you have already experienced ChatGPT, chatbots, and that strand of research. Can you guys share some ideas, please?
Can I just for a second interrupt?
Yes.
My name is Anya Lyon. I just wanted to say that, first of all, thank you guys for this discussion. It's been very good. But I don't think you can actually even talk about Call until our guests, Andrew and Jonathan, I don't know your name.
Jason.
Sorry, Jason Anderson, yes. Until you both commit yourself to a definition of language. Because if this is what we're in the business of to teach, then we need to actually define what is it that we're in the business of, and then we can say what implications does this have for technology. Otherwise, everything is dissociated. And people who are listening now and people who will listen in the future will also have all of this dissociated in their heads. So can you start with what's language and then implications for Call?
So
that is a really interesting question, Anya. It's not one that I've actually kind of engage with in my writing a great deal. And that's an important point, I think, you know, which you would probably make, Anya, there, that we need to start with that fundamentally. Certainly, the more I read and write about translanguaging and think about that, that definitely has influenced what I understand language to be. And I'm also very interested in the evolution of language, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. And yet I would say, Anya, that my definition, my understanding of language, I don't necessarily agree I have to commit myself to a definition to be able to discuss these topics. But it is an interesting question. And my definition, my understanding of language is a fuzzy understanding. In other words, it's not a constricted definition. One of the issues is if you define language using language, then you're in fact using the very tool you're trying to define to create it. And one of the problems with language in the written form and language in terms of, for example, a set definition, as academia loves so much, is that it pins something down, something that is actually complex, dynamic, moving, and changing. And we see this with translanguaging. So if we were to take a definition of languaging, that language is social practice, that involves communication, those would be kind of two staple features of what we mean when we talk about language. We can then argue that we may need to distinguish animal versus human communication and use language as the means to do that. But that would be a very long discussion that would take us in all kinds of areas. But certainly I wouldn't define language in terms of fixed codes, systems that themselves exist as a priori before our first order languaging. And I would probably suggest the work of Nigel Love, a linguist, who talks about first order languaging as a really useful metaphor for understanding actually what that communication is and how and why we need to look at that as the notion of language prior to the notion of codified systems. But very interesting question, Anya. Thank you.
Andrew? Is Andrew around?
Yes, Andrew's around. The first thing that I would say is that language is not what linguists call language. It is not a set of formalisms, and it is not a reified array of the things that we call syntax, morphology, and phonology. It's none of those things. It is the combined use of all the means available to enable people to make meanings from the representations of thoughts, which we call messages.
Yeah, but you're getting away. You're giving yourself an easy way out when you talk about making.
It's not an easy way out at all, because it
Every
makes
student can say that.
What? Oh,
Every student.
My students never say that.
Well, I think every student can say make meaning. I just think that you need to now describe the process, because otherwise you're getting away with murder, so to speak.
Well, the description of the process is a little bit like Jason's fuzzy logic or fuzzy system, where we.
So none of you essentially.
None of us is going to commit ourselves to a strict definition of what language is, or for that matter, what communication is, or how meaning making works, because we are still ignorant of how that actually happens. The best that we can do is make a best guess, have a best guess approach to what works. And what works is not what we say works, but what enables people, students, and that was my original point, what enables students to achieve their, let's call it, communicative objective. And I don't want to, I don't believe that communication actually works in the sense that people share things or send or actually transmit information or any of that sort of stuff. As you know, you can also go and read my article with Sussex on this. which contains 5 points about how, in my opinion,
Yeah.
in a kind of semi-constructivist perspective, meaning is made. So I'm arguing that we live in a world which is not solid, which is dynamic and constantly changing, which is fuzzy, and which draws on whatever is needed at any particular time in order to be able to produce representations of our thoughts and enable the meaning making from those representations in the people that we are talking with.
Yeah, as a teacher, I would have, or teacher educator, I would have liked a nicest, tighter definition, so that I actually know what learner-centeredness means as a result of that.
Learner-centeredness as a result of that means the solution of moment-to-moment problems according to the facilities
Yes,
that are available.
Yes.
And Andrew points remind me of something that we discussed in the previous intellectual discussions. Which word for whom in what context? We cannot provide any strict definition of anything, right?
But you know the difference between you and me writing and the difference between the Harvard person writing is as follows. You and I may have way better solutions and way better insight, but the Harvard person will produce the first 10 pages or 5 pages of their article with readings that literally knock the air out of us, right? And I think that that's what I want to push for, that we actually enrich the story in a way that actually makes the connections and justifies things. Because if we don't do it, not only we can say to ourselves, "Oh, we're not from Harvard, so that's all right," but it's a loser's justification. But then we have the other thing that we're allowing to jump people on bandwagons of social justice, of who's solving the social justice. We have the grammar of social justice. Translanguaging, another thing is we're allowing this for this. We don't know what it is, but we're enabling this because that takes us from something else. But we don't really know. We need to have a bit more insightful analysis of why translanguaging became a bandwagon, and was it really a response to the terror of English in class? Let me just come up with a simpler explanation why there was a terror of English spoken in the class, and not everybody could actually comply with it because they didn't have enough language or God knows whatever else. It was simply because the assumption was that you'll learn language in classroom, and the source of the divinity of language was your teacher or textbook sometimes, right? Language was not in the interactions between you and the world, but it was between you and the teacher, and that you and the teacher holy relationship continues to be in the literature, and we continuously imprison the child in the school or the student in the education setting in that relationship with the teacher. And we continuously talk about that magic of scaffolding between the teacher and the student, and we continuously cut out the world. We have, I'm just not going to push it any further.
Anya, but it sounds to me like what you're expressing here is quite strongly within that social justice tradition. You're making a key point here that Harvard, it's your example, and we can talk about all Anglocentric discourse on language teaching and learning, is dominating communities of teachers around the world.
Yes, right.
Who don't necessarily work in the same context.
What I'm saying is when I think there's a guy called, what's his name, Dodo or whatever his name, Dede? I can't remember. Anyway, there's a guy from Harvard, right? So it doesn't have to be in language teaching, it can be in anywhere. I cannot see them delivering much for my job, but I hear the story, the amount of readings they cover to get to whatever point they get. And what I'm saying is, in our definitions or in our approaches to capture the concept of language, we're not actually drawing on anything really strong enough to give us a direction for learner-centeredness, to give us a direction for language teaching. I hear what you both say, and you both are on the same page. And it's not that I am not, but we had people like Bourdieu who were talking about the power of delegation. We had semioticians who were talking about asserting your authority over discursive situations. We have readings that say that language is like a skin. We all have it, except that each of us has a different one and works with it differently. So we need to actually enrich our discourse about language with readings so that we stand as teachers and as teacher educators firmly, rather than, have a finger in the air and check where the direction of the wind blows. And then go from bandwagon to bandwagon and say, oh, this is fuzzy and this is nice because, whether I think we need to actually know what we're talking about in a story that is firm and it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that is an interesting point that Anya made.
I have never thought about it as strongly. I mean, I have, but not as strongly as I think now. A publication landed on my lap from Indonesia, written by a number of people put together in a context, and they produced a very messy publication. And the only way to save it and to make it a category 1 publication, was to actually analyze all kinds of things that they mentioned in the publication and order it. And the more I look at it, I got responses from reviewers, and I'm just doing some more tightening. And the more I look at it, these sort of questions I just raised become strongly in front of my eyes, because strongly positioned in front of my eyes. And I can see the necessity for clarity. Otherwise, I think that we can say learner-centeredness is somewhere else, where it is not somewhere else.
And is there any chance we can move back to the discourse that we plan to discuss? Because I think learner-centeredness is a really important topic, but I don't think it's directly or even necessarily related. The question about what language is, I think many of us would argue that we don't know, that nobody knows, in a sense that they can define. You can write a definition that's concrete, you can teach it, but it doesn't mean it will help you to analyze and understand what happens in the real world. So I disagree with the fundamental point you're making, Anya, that we need a concrete definition of language before we can have this discussion. But the discussion is about those trends. It's about what is changing. And in that sense, it's a discussion about social practice, just as all discussions of trends are about why are we interested in some things at some times and not others. Your point about language is really interesting, but I don't think we need to answer it before we discuss what is the topic for this talk.
Okay, everyone, sorry to interrupt, but we only have about 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like to get back to our next topic of discussions, the call, ChatGPT, chatbots, and how should we apply that to as another new train of research. So Andrew and Jason, could you please help me with this? And everyone, I would like you guys, if you have any question, please send it to the chat box so that we can answer, because we don't have much time left, everyone. You can answer, you can ask questions related to what we've been talking about, or you can even share some of your own experience about new research trends, or if you have any problem doing research right now, finding trends, or specifying your research interest, you can ask questions as well. Okay, so get back to call, and Andrew, can you say something? What we are going to have? I specific like the rhizomatic system and precision language education you've been talking about, and how can call help with that?
That's not core. Rhizomatic systems are not core. Precision language education is not core. These are products of reflection and also ideological positions, as well as products of research. So the stuff in precision language education comes out of research. So I'm not going to talk about that. I think to go back to Anya's point and to Jason's point, I mean, I think the fuzziness is actually, we need to be able to deal with the uncertainty of dealing with each other at any particular time, and then drawing on whatever it is. And I think one can have definitions of communication which include an uncertainty component. One of the things I wanted to say, I look, everybody went crazy when ChatGPT arrived. Me too. And why did I go crazy with ChatGPT? Because it allowed me to write. You don't know this. 40 years ago, Calico, the premier journal in computer-assisted language learning, was founded in 1983. So that's 40 years since it was founded. 1983 is also the year that I wrote a paper on generative computer-assisted language learning. So generative call is not new. ChatGPT conceptually is not new. Right?
Yeah.
It's actually been going on for quite a while, and it wasn't new when I wrote about it. So people before that were writing about it in the 50s and 60s. So don't kid yourselves. The only thing that's new is two things. A, somebody actually managed to write ChatGPT, and it can understand us.
Yeah.
It actually can understand us. I can ask it specific questions about doing this or that, like writing a computer program, and it will answer me in detail. That is the most amazing thing. If there is a language comprehension system that works. That's number one. Number two is that it is available for everybody. And that democratizes the whole system and gives us a whole bunch of power. Now, I don't know if you watch YouTube, but I do, or at least I'm subscribed to various channels. And there is a collection of people on YouTube these days which are telling us how YouTube will change language learning. They know. It's like the guy sitting on the plane, in the seat next to me on the plane, who tells me how language learning works. And I dread having these conversations with them. Where are you going? I'm going to Paris. Oh, really? What are you going to do there? I'm going to do research on how to teach French. Oh, really? I know how we should teach languages. You should parachute them into the middle of France. They didn't do that when I went to high school. Everybody is an expert in language teaching. And now we have a collection of people who are all experts in language teaching, telling us how to use ChatGPT. Because you may or may not know this, you can actually chat with spoken language with ChatGPT. And you can give it instructions as to how to react to your language. So you might say to it, we're going to have a chat in Spanish. So listen to me, we'll chat about this or that. And ChatGPT obediently says, yes, sure, no problem. And then you say to it, and if I make really bad mistakes, please correct me. And ChatGPT says, yes, no problem. And so you have this conversation. And when you make a bad mistake, it tells you. How does it tell you? Why does it tell you? I mean, what's the story that it tells you about your mistake? I have no idea where that comes from. It may be a very bad story for you, or it may be a very good story for you. So all of these issues are really quite interesting in language learning. The main issue that people have at the moment is that they are horrified that students are going to go and ask ChatGPT to write their essays about second language acquisition. Write me 500 words about SLA. Actually, I asked it to write me 1,000 words, 1,500 words about translanguaging the other day, right? I said to it, write me 1,500 words about translanguaging. And it tried about 10 times and could only come up with 600. which was kind of interesting. So maybe it's not quite as bad as we think. However, having said that, we also know that ChatGPT can pass first-year exams in some topic, in some subject or other at Harvard. This was reported just recently. Well, my reaction is, well, there's nothing wrong with ChatGPT passing the exam, but why, how come they're passing Harvard exams? The problem is with Harvard, not with ChatGPT. As far as people writing essays using ChatGPT or articles using ChatGPT, I have absolutely no objection. I think it can help them to understand better how the writing process works. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't. But they should be responsible for content. As far as actually passing exams or tests or interviews for jobs and for admission to universities and so on, I think we will have to change our assessment system in order to make sure that they are actually doing the performance, not some other machine. Having said that, in real life, they will always have these things available to help them produce better text, and they will save a whole bunch of time. And I wonder what the difference is between using ChatGPT to check your English and paying somebody as an editor to do that work. I mean, there's really not much difference at all, because there are also companies which you can pay money to, and they will write the whole essay for you. So let's not kid ourselves. The situation is very simple. We have a development that we had not predicted. What will happen is that we will adapt. That's what humans are good at doing, adapting to situations. When I was in school, we didn't have calculators, we had slide rules. And you don't know what slide rules are, but slide rules were like calculators with multiple functions on them. And we were not allowed to have slide rules because, you know, we had to use logarithmic tables. And then that went, and then the calculators came in, and then we had a big panic, and then that panic disappeared. It's okay. We will survive. Imagine when we had the first motor cars, we used to have a guy with a flag walking in front of the motor car to make sure that nobody got run over, or that they wouldn't frighten the horses or something like that. It's just the way it is. So let's not panic about this. Let's find solutions. If what I don't understand is why entire nations like China are banning ChatGPT. That is beyond me. Whereas in fact, what could be done is to tighten up. If you're worried about assessment, tighten it up. If you're worried about cheating, because everybody's into cheating, so, well, somewhere somebody will be discovered. Everybody, if you put in the right forms of assessment and the right forms of tracking and so on, and you want people to actually know things, it can be done. It's just that it will be less convenient than it is now.
All right. I have one question. Sorry, I have many questions, but one question from Nghĩa, and I would like Jason to help me answer this question. So he said that he hoped to conduct a paper on the effectiveness of chatbots, ChatGPT, kind of that chatbots, in enhancing students' academic writing. But all he found so far is only 3 research articles that are strict to chatbots and teaching writing. So what should he do, right? Is that your question? Yeah. Hello.
Yes,
Whose
sir.
question
Yes,
was
sir.
that? Was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir. That was my very concern, sir. Yeah, Mr. Quang and Mr. Anderson, my very concern.
Yeah, he has only 3 articles on that. And what should he do? Jason.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm incredibly fascinated by it, and I'm using ChatGPT and Google Bard all the time. And just a little tip for anyone else, while these things may improve quite quickly, it's really useful to triangulate, because Bard and ChatGPT use slightly different sources in different ways. and you can get very different answers. Just a little bit about what my university is doing. This is something concrete I can say. We're not banning these things. We're in very early stages of developing a policy, but roughly what I can say is that we're recognizing, in the way that Andrew said, that these are new tools, and in the way that Andrew said, these are just building on prior iterations of ways in which computers can respond intelligently to our input. And as a result, things like Microsoft spell checkers and Grammarly, things like Google Scholar, and things like how we're doing Google searches, this is just building on that. These are sources whereby we can compile information that we need to draw upon to get whatever we need done. And as Andrew said, very importantly, this is equitable. It's something that is at least somebody who has internet access and enough processing power to use around the world. And in that sense, it could be a really important leveler. It can enable academic scholars, people who don't necessarily have the right to discourse in English.
Sir, I think I share a viewpoint with you that a new technology and also what countless of technologies and tools are available out there. The thing is not to ban them. Well, ChatGPT or chatbots are not created so that we ban the student on using it. But the thing is on instruct the students on how to use it in the right manner.
Right. And so a good example of that is to triangulate between different AI systems and check to see what they're saying. The key point for me is that every student still, if this is still true, must take personal responsibility for what they submit. So if we're talking about academia in higher education, where they're writing essays, the student is actually giving a piece of writing, and they're saying several things when they're submitting that, at least in most universities and most academic writing contexts. This is my work. I believe this to be true. And the work itself includes those sources of truths. In other words, the referencing I do. And one of the fascinating things that even today, ChatGPT-4 is still making massive, massive problems with referencing. So one of the things that we are saying to our students is, don't trust it for that. You can even ask it about a potential source, and it can sometimes get about half of the reference right. But if you copy paste it, you'll probably be in trouble for inappropriate referencing, inventing references, which would be academic conduct. That would be quite serious. And the important thing is that if you cite something in your paper, you as the student need to be responsible for saying this source is an appropriate source for supporting this argument. And unless the student goes to the original source to check that, they can't be certain that that's the case. And we as those of us who mark or look at the students' work and are trying to help them will also be able to look at those sources, A, if they exist, and B, to say if they support the point. And that's an important part of what we can do in terms of giving feedback. And as a number of the writers on these new technologies have said, these technologies can also give really useful feedback. So if we train our students not just to write using these technologies, but to give feedback on them, but then at the end of the day, the thing that they submit, they are saying, I believe this to be an appropriate, answer to that question, then that is what we assess, and we assess it in that way. And asking the kind of questions that are more useful, particularly for the student and for the assessment itself. As Andrew said, if Harvard are asking questions that ChatGPT can write passable answers to, maybe it's the questions that's the problem. The knowledge is out there. It's been out there for a long, long time now with the internet. And our questions shouldn't be simply about knowledge, about what is X, what is the difference between X and Y. That's the kind of thing that ChatGPT can do really well. But they have to, for example, include personalization. What is the difference between X and Y? Which one was more important for you in your own language development and why? And that's the kind of question that we might ask at Warwick. And we may also ask the students not only to link it to their own development, but to link it to their own research. So, for example, if the student's in a small term paper or an essay, will actually draw upon their own research into doing something and link that to literature. So this notion of personalization, or specifically kind of research related, writing related to their own research, what they themselves are doing, is an important way that we can create appropriate and more useful learning tasks, because ChatGPT can do all of the boring and less useful ones that essentially involve lower order thinking.
You know what? Well, I usually try to ask ChatGPT to produce an answer to a question that I ask, and then I try to argue with it in a way that, because it constantly do reasoning with you, so even you can enhance your cognitive capacity using ChatGPT. And well, I don't know, but you can use that for your student here. And that corrects, that directly relate to a sentence that Mr. Kai said. ChatGPT is a kind of fast food in ELT. Well, that is not really. I have to disagree with you, because it is how you consume the food. It is not about the food itself. Like ChatGPT, well, you can use it to do different stuff. You can even ask it to
cut a significant amount of time.
With different techniques. Like the student usually, create some text using ChatGPT, and then I ask them to sit there inside a classroom and try to analyze whether the text is reasonable or not, or is sensible or not. And if it is not sensible, then they have to write something to convince me that the article is not reasonable. So you have many ways to deal with it. Long ago, centuries ago, people used to say that computers are bad. And then they said long even before that, they said that books are bad. Because it will worsen our memory. But then what? Well, sometimes we have to let nature take its course, and we have to move with the development of the world. We cannot just shut the door and stay inside of our room and say, well, I cannot communicate, I will not interact with the development of the world.
What will be, will be, and we have to cope with that.
And I really like Anderson's ideas for that. The students are the ones who responsible for what they submit. And even if that text is created by ChatGPT, well, they have to be responsible for that. And we have to develop policies on that, not to ban a tool, because it's just a tool.
Mr. Quang, will it lead to a new way of ELT testing and assessment, that we allow the use of chatbot and AI, but then we find out a way to assess whether the work is honest or not, or just like 100% created by the chatbots?
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, can I just make a point? I've got to go on the dot at 11 o'clock because I want to watch my team playing in the Football World Cup final, which starts at 11. Oh, sorry, in 5 minutes. I know everyone's on different times. So before you answer that question, I would have to sign off because it's a really interesting one and requires a lot of discussion.
Okay, Jason, thank you very much for your time. It was a great pleasure to help you here with us today. And I hope that sometimes you may have a chance to come to Vietnam, and we have more discussion.
I'd love to. I'd love to. All right.
Thanks so much, Jason. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, as well. It's been really nice being involved in a discussion involving different people, different opinions, and not somebody lecturing somebody, particularly somebody from my demographic in Vietnam. Thank you, guys, for all your contributions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Can I just say one thing about ChatGPT? You were wondering about testing. We already have tests which make sure that you don't cheat. The big tests, IELTS, TOEFL, TOEIC, all of those are done in such a way that you cannot, unless you send someone else in there with your identification in order to pass the test. So the systems are already in place. What we have to do now is do the same thing in schools and universities if that's what we want to do. I wanted to add a couple of things. The first one is that we are entering a world, we are already in a world where people are learning in a random manner through access to Google, and because they have access to Google, they have access to personalization. If you have a problem with your printer, you go to YouTube and say, tell me how to fix my printer, and YouTube helps you. Now we will just have a way of doing it more effectively. Nothing has changed It's just that the means of doing this is better, and the means of refining what you need is better, because you can use language in order to achieve a greater degree of personalization. And the fact that we have that personalization is an integral part of our lives, with high levels of information as well, is very important, because it means that we expect the same thing from education. Education, on the other hand, tends not to personalize things as much as it could. Okay, I'll just finish this.
And that is directly related to precision language teaching.
Yes, it is.
Yes, and that was your question here. Anyway, we have another question right here from Miss Tan. Right? Sorry, it's from Wun An first. Do you think English subjects will be like philosophy subjects? I think in the future, no one needs English at university levels. We have ways to improve English skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Well, may I answer this question? Well, in the future, we don't need English anymore, and we don't even need language anymore. If that is the way that we look at the future, because in the future there will be devices and tools that we just like insert into our mind, inject it like a chip or something, a device into your mind, and so that you don't need to communicate, you don't need to use your mouth, your tongue, anything. You don't need to create voice anymore, and you just need to send signals to other people. And that is how we look at the future. If we look at from a science fiction way, of course. So in the future, we will not need English. We will not need anything. We will not need language. But that is a very, very far away future, I think, Wenan. And at that, well, education is not just about learning to use language for reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Yes, we learn English to master these skills, but education is to to practice and to sharpen your mind, to enhance your cognitive capacity. So yes, there will be a time when the whole society changes, and even we will communicate in a different manner. But I think right now what we need to focus most is how to, well, create an environment so that learning is emphasized rather than teaching. And well, when you look at liberal education or things like that, well, student can choose what is necessary for them. So all of these topics are just in time, not just in case. So you go to the class because you think it is necessary for them. And just like philosophy, if a student go to that kind of classroom to study because they think that that is necessary to develop their mind, then they go for it. And Vietnam and any other country in the world, I think, will come to a stage of liberal education when the students choose what is necessary for them. And the teachers will give up their power and their right to say that this is right for you or this is wrong for you. I think we will reach that stage, but I don't think it's now. I think it needs more time in the future. And one last question before we end our today conversation, everyone, from Ms. Tan. How would we take advantage of technologies, AI, to change the way we provide language input, reinforce input, and the way we interact with our student, the way we access learnings and language performance? Andrew, please help me with this one.
Well, it's a very interesting issue. I don't see any faces anymore, which is annoying. Okay. So here's a couple of ways. For example, instead of reading or buying books from somewhere and reading page 27 every couple of weeks, what we're going to find is that people generate their own text according to whatever parameters they want to generate text with. They might want a conversation with a travel agent, they might want a conversation with a philosopher, they might want a conversation with, and then they will get some practice, and then they will get some help, and then they will get some support. The other way that's going to be happening, and I'll be talking about that in November, in December actually, is people will be able to create their own lessons, for example. So if they want to have a lesson on, in my favorite topics, they want to have a lesson on intonation patterns of French, they will be able to say, show me some yes/no questions, show me some information questions, contrast these questions for me, show them to me in a video, analyze the language for me and help me. And these are questions that they may need to ask in order to be able to perform some greater task, which might be a project-based task or a simulation of some kind. And that way that they will be able to generate their own texts and get some assistance along the way, which happens to be the kind of assistance they want. They might say, I don't want to listen to you pronouncing this, I want a phonetic transcription, or whatever. So we're going to go into a situation where personalization is going to become more important, and personalization is going to mean things like providing people with examples and texts and support that they want when they want it. And if the people are not able to make good decisions, then they will be helped with either humans or with some kind of decision support system that will give them choices. And in addition, they will also be able to benefit from things like precision education, where if people have a problem pronouncing S's at the end of words, for example, as we were saying before, S's at the end of words, then they may be able to be sensitized by listening to S sounds, which have been treated in a particular kind of way. I have to add one more thing, though, and that is that the nature of the physical signal that people will be subjected to will become much more important over the next decade or so, as we suddenly realize that perception is actually an important part of the interface between the soul, or if you want to call it the soul, and the outside world. You can't avoid the body. The body's going to sit in between you. And that's one of the reasons why we are unlikely to have direct mental transmissions of the kind that Wang was talking about. Even if we have direct signals between each other, in the end they're likely to be semiotic in nature when they get into the meaning-making systems of humans. That's the end of my story for today. Wang, we can't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So we have come to an end of our discussions. I would like to summarize things up before we end our discussions. First of all, I've asked you some questions about what you think is your research interest, and we've received answers like critical language studies, mixed level class, vocabulary, incidental vocabulary acquisition, classroom management, multimodality. And I wish Anya was there when they talk about multimodality, because I know that you can talk more about multisensory, multimodality stuff, corrective feedback and things like that. And then we came to another discussions like, why do we have follow trains? And is that really necessary to follow trains? And Andrew says that dogma defeats the data. And the problem with the outliers is that they are not within a discourse of that is dominant. And then we remember that as far as I can remember, Andrew says that science only progresses from funerals to funerals. That is very interesting point he made. And later on, Jason's have already provided us with some trends that he think is currently popular, and we have very interesting even debates and arguments. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree on many of these points. And I really like Anna's ideas when we ask about, well, regardless of what the trend is going on right now, we have to get to the basic understanding of language. But of course, the two speakers agree that it is very hard, it is very difficult, and sometimes it is not very is a very challenging task for us to define concretely what language is. And from Jason's perspective, I believe that social justice is currently the driving force of all the new trends that we have right now, with of course technology and the two main driving force, because they are what's changing the whole society, which is directly related to our field. Okay, and then we have, because of the time limited, so we have some questions about call and ChatGPT and AI. And interestingly, I know that many of us are concerned about the use of ChatGPT in education, but I have to reaffirm you that both of our speakers have already said that they're just tools, and what matters most is how we use the tools to enhance our or even teaching and learning. The most important point is that we have to develop policies to maximize the efforts of the tools, to maximize the effects, the benefits of the tools rather than banning them. Okay, so this is.
So can I interrupt? Can I interrupt before you finish? I wanted to say one word about translanguaging. Translanguaging, you would be forgiven for believing that translanguaging is the product of social justice. Actually, what I actually think is that translanguaging came from the fact that people got fed up with being told, you can't use another language in the classroom, you can't use another language, when quite obviously using the mother tongue or the language of the local community solved so many problems without actually undermining anything. And then the social justice people got hold of it, and made it a big deal in their terms. But I think we need to be very careful when talking about social justice. No one is against social justice, right? No one is against social. Why would you be against social justice? But just be careful about how everything becomes a question of social justice. I think in this case, it's a very simple thing, which is, hey, let's just be practical about this. And they did, and they were, after 30 years of hiding behind the door and pretending not to use the local language in their classroom. It's out.
Right. So the practicality of language is another point that we make today. Right. Okay. Everyone, this is our last event of our series. Sorry that I skipped one or two events about ethics in language research and qualitative qualitative research approach, because of some of my health issues and other personal issues. But I really regret to inform you that this is our last event of our series. And but of course, we will have further discussion and webinars for different stories. I hope that through our series we can I don't know whether we can inspire you or not, but we can inspire the feeling that we can be more intellectual, be more practical, be more rational about the things we say, and we can avoid assumptions in the way that we do research. I would like to say thank you again, Dr. Andrew Leon, Professor Andrew Leon, Dr. Jason Anderson, Dr. Anya, especially Dr. Andrew, Professor Andrew, and Dr. Anya, because you have always been here to support us in many events and many shows, and we learn a lot. We learn a lot from you two and from other speakers as well. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you guys again in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you. Bye-bye, everyone. See ya.
Bye. See you. Thank you.